Stand at the sun gate on the Inca Trail above Machu Picchu, look down at the ridge below you, and your brain does something interesting. It refuses, for a moment, to accept what it's seeing as real. Not because the ruins are impressive, though they are, but because of where they are. A city. A complete, functional, sophisticated city sitting on a narrow mountain ridge at 7,972 feet above sea level, surrounded on three sides by sheer drops into the Urubamba River Valley 2,000 feet below, in one of the most geologically active and rain-soaked environments on Earth. Nearly 80 inches of rainfall per year. Earthquakes that would flatten conventional construction. Slopes so steep that the engineers who have studied this site estimate that just reaching the ridge to begin construction required solving logistical problems most modern contractors wouldn't know how to approach. And it was built without iron tools, without steel, without the wheel, without a written language to record the plans. The question of how Machu Picchu exists has answers. They come from geology, from archaeology, from engineering analysis, and from the history of the empire that built it. None of those answers make the site less extraordinary. If anything, understanding how it was done makes it harder to stand at the sun gate and accept that what you're looking at is real. Let's start with the man who ordered it built. By the early 1400s, the Inca were one civilization among many in the Andean region of South America, dominant in their immediate area around Cusco, but not yet an empire in any meaningful sense. What changed that was a single man named Pachacuti Inca Yupanqui, who came to power in 1438 and is, by the consensus of modern historians, the closest thing the pre-Columbian Americas produced to an Alexander or a Caesar. Pachacuti, whose name translates roughly as Earth Shaker or He who overturns space and time, was the ninth ruler of the Inca. He came to power in the specific context of a military crisis. The neighboring Chanca Confederation had attacked Cusco, and his father, the reigning Sapa Inca, had reportedly fled. The accounts say Pachacuti held the city, defeated the Chanca, and then displaced his father to take control. Whether those accounts are precise history or embellished myth is debated. What is not debated is what happened afterward. Pachacuti built an empire. Starting from Cusco and expanding in every direction, he and his military commanders brought more territory under Inca control in roughly 3 decades than most empires achieve in a century. By his death in 1471, the Inca Empire stretched from what is now Ecuador and Colombia in the north to the northern parts of Chile and Argentina in the south, roughly 3,000 miles of the most difficult terrain on Earth, connected by a road network of over 25,000 miles that the Inca built without the wheel and maintained through a relay messenger system that could transmit information from one end of the empire to the other in days. The Inca road system is, by many engineering assessments, one of the greatest infrastructure achievements in human history. It is also almost entirely invisible to most people who know the word Inca. Pachacuti also rebuilt Cusco, the imperial capital, transforming it from a regional city into a metropolis laid out according to a cosmological plan, with the great Temple of the Sun at its center. And sometime around 1450, he ordered the construction of something else, a private royal estate, built on a mountain ridge so remote and so difficult to reach that the Spanish, who conquered the Inca in 1532, apparently never found it. That estate was Machu Picchu. The purpose of Machu Picchu is more settled than the popular mystery narrative suggests. The current archaeological and historical consensus based on analysis of the site's architecture, the ceramics found there, and the documents from the Spanish colonial period that describe Inca royal estates is that Machu Picchu was a royal retreat, a place of relaxation, hunting, religious ceremony, and aristocratic entertainment for Pachacuti and his successors, not a primary residence, not an administrative capital. a private mountain estate of extraordinary quality, accessible only to the emperor, his family, his nobles, and the servants and specialists who maintained it. The lower classes of Inca society could not enter. At its height of occupation, historians estimate approximately 750 people lived at the site, a small, elite population by the standards of any Inca settlement. What makes Machu Picchu architecturally remarkable is not that it was lavish by royal standards, it's that it exists on this particular ridge at all, and that it has survived in the condition it has survived in for close to 6 centuries. The explanation for both of those things starts underground. In 2019, Rualdo Menegat, a geologist at Brazil's Federal University of Rio Grande do Sul, presented findings at the annual meeting of the Geological Society of America that had taken 11 years of field expeditions and satellite analysis to produce. What Menegat's team found was that Machu Picchu does not sit on this particular ridge by accident or by mystical inspiration. It sits there because this specific ridge, at this specific elevation, is the intersection of multiple major tectonic fault lines. 2 primary fault systems cross beneath Machu Picchu in an X-shaped pattern. One fault runs roughly northwest to southeast. Another runs northeast to southwest. In the middle, where they intersect, is the site. Menegat found that this same pattern, settlements positioned at fault line intersections, appears at other major Inca centers: Cusco, Pisac, Ollantaytambo. The Inca weren't placing their cities on fault lines by coincidence or despite the geological hazard. They were placing them there because of specific advantages that fault lines provided. The first advantage was stone. The hard granite of the Machu Picchu batholith, 250 million-year-old bedrock, had been cracked and fractured by centuries of tectonic movement along the fault lines. Menegat's analysis found that these pre-existing fractures produced granite blocks already broken into angular shapes, triangles, rhombuses, regular geometric forms that required significantly less cutting and shaping than solid, uncracked bedrock would have needed. In Menegat's own words, published in the Geological Society of America press release, the intense fracturing there predisposed the rocks to breaking along these same planes of weakness, which greatly reduced the energy needed to carve them. It would be impossible to build such a site in the high mountains if the substrate was not fractured. The Inca had, in effect, selected a location where geology had done a significant portion of the quarrying for them. The second advantage was water. Fault lines channel underground water movement. The same fracture systems that cracked the granite into useful building material also directed snowmelt and rainwater to the ridge, providing a reliable freshwater supply at high altitude. At nearly 8,000 feet above sea level, reliable water is not guaranteed, but the fault geology at Machu Picchu created a natural spring system that fed the site's elaborate hydraulic infrastructure. The third advantage was drainage. This is the part of Machu Picchu that almost no visitor to the site sees, and it is arguably the most impressive engineering achievement of the entire construction. According to research documented by PBS Nova and confirmed by multiple independent geological analyses, between 50 and 60% of the total construction effort at Machu Picchu, more than half of all the labor that went into building the site, was underground. Foundations, drainage channels, subsurface terracing. Menegat specifically found that approximately 2/3 of the total construction effort involved subsurface drainage infrastructure. The visible temples, plazas, and residences that people photograph are, in a structural sense, secondary to the hidden system holding them up. The terraces that cover the hillsides below the visible ruins were built in layers: a base of large boulders, a middle layer of gravel, a top layer of soil. This layered construction allows water to move through the terraces rather than pool behind them, preventing the waterlogging and saturation that causes landslides on steep mountain slopes. The site has 130 documented drainage holes built into the architecture. The water management system, including a series of 16 interconnected stone fountains called the Stairway of Fountains that distributed fresh water through the residential and ceremonial areas, still functions today, more than 570 years after it was built during a rainfall regime of nearly 80 inches per year. The Spanish colonial structures built in Cusco after 1532 using mortar and conventional European techniques have required continuous repair and reconstruction. Machu Picchu, abandoned and covered in vegetation for 4 centuries, needed relatively little structural remediation when it was cleared. The geology explains the location and the survival. The construction technique explains the quality. The Inca had no iron. They had no steel. They worked stone using bronze tools, chisels, wedges, hammer stones, and wooden implements. They moved stones weighing up to 15 tons to this ridge without the wheel, using rope, wooden rollers, ramps of compacted earth, and coordinated human labor on a scale that modern engineers who have studied the logistics still find difficult to fully account for. Some of the granite used in Machu Picchu's finest buildings came from quarries 16 to 32 kilometers from the site. The journey from quarry to ridge, at the elevation and slope involved with a 15-ton block of stone, is an engineering problem the Inca solved with organizational capacity that produced results their materials shouldn't theoretically have been able to achieve. The stonework itself is what most visitors focus on, and correctly so. The Inca masonry technique is called ashlar, the precision cutting and fitting of stone blocks without mortar. At Machu Picchu, the best examples of ashlar stonework are so precise that a knife blade cannot be inserted between adjacent stones. A piece of paper cannot be slid between them. Each block was individually shaped to match the specific stones it would touch, not to a standard template, but to its exact neighbors, meaning that the stones could only be assembled in one configuration and in one order. This is not mass production. This is custom craftsmanship at industrial scale applied to thousands of individual stone joints across a 5-mile site. The absence of mortar was not a limitation. It was a deliberate engineering choice, and a better one than the alternative. When an earthquake strikes and the Urubamba Valley is seismically active, a mortared wall behaves as a rigid unit. The force of the seismic wave cannot be absorbed or distributed. The mortar cracks, the stones shift, the wall collapses. A mortarless ashlar wall behaves differently. The individual stones can move slightly relative to each other, absorbing seismic energy without cracking, then settle back into their fitted positions when the shaking stops. The walls of Machu Picchu have survived earthquakes that destroyed Spanish colonial buildings in Cusco. They were specifically designed to do this, not by accident, but by the accumulated engineering knowledge of a civilization that had been building in the Andes for centuries. The walls also lean slightly inward, a subtle batter angle that increases stability and reduces the leverage that seismic or wind forces can exert on the wall face. The trapezoid shapes, used for doorways and windows wider at the base than the top, distribute load more efficiently than rectangular openings and have been independently identified by structural engineers as superior to the rectangular alternatives in earthquake-prone environments. Now let's talk about the people who built all of this. The Inca did not use slave labor in the way most people understand the term. They used a system called mit'a, a form of labor taxation in which every able-bodied male member of a subject community owed a specified period of labor to the state per year. In exchange, the state fed the workers from imperial storehouses, clothed them, provided their tools, and supported their families during the period of service. It was compulsory, it was state-directed, and it was the foundation of the entire Inca construction economy. The roads, the temples, the agricultural terraces, the storehouses, all of it was built through Mata. At Machu Picchu, historians estimate approximately 5,000 workers were engaged in construction at peak activity, with the project taking roughly 20 years to reach completion around 1470. The workers were specialists, masons, engineers, hydraulic technicians, agricultural workers building the terraces, not a general, undifferentiated labor force. The quality of the stonework at Machu Picchu required masons who had spent years developing the skills to shape individual stones to sub-millimeter tolerances using bronze and stone tools. This was not work that could be done by untrained conscripts. The site also required the construction of the infrastructure to support construction: roads to bring materials to the ridge, food storage facilities to feed the workforce, residential structures for the workers themselves, all of which had to be built before or alongside the main construction. Machu Picchu's existence required Machu Picchu to exist before Machu Picchu could be built in a logistical sense. The supply chain was the first engineering challenge before a single stone of the main structures was placed. The Inca Empire that built all of this collapsed remarkably quickly. The Spanish conquistador Francisco Pizarro arrived in Peru in 1532 with 168 men and captured the Sapa Inca Atahualpa, who was at that moment in the middle of a civil war with his half-brother Huascar that had fractured the empire's unity. The disease that European contact had already introduced moved faster than the Spanish army. By some estimates, as much as 90% of the Andean population died in the century following first European contact, primarily from smallpox, typhus, and other pathogens for which indigenous populations had no immunity. The empire that had built Machu Picchu, the road system, Cusco, and hundreds of other sites across 3,000 miles of the Andes was functionally dismantled within a generation of Pizarro's arrival. Machu Picchu was abandoned, probably sometime in the second half of the 16th century, most likely due to a combination of the collapse of the imperial system that maintained and populated it, and the epidemic mortality that devastated the workforce and the support networks. The site was not unknown. Local indigenous communities in the Urubamba Valley were aware of its existence and continued to farm parts of the surrounding terraces. It was not lost in any meaningful sense to the people living around it. What happened in 1911 was not discovery. It was introduction. Hiram Bingham III was a Yale University professor of South American history on an expedition searching for Vitkos and Vilcabamba, the last Inca capitals where the remnant Inca state had retreated after Cusco fell to the Spanish. On July 24th, 1911, Bingham was guided up the steep trails to the site by a local farmer and, according to multiple accounts, by a young boy named Pablito Alvarez who knew the ruins and led Bingham to them. A Peruvian researcher named Agustin Lizarraga had visited and documented the site in 1902, 9 years earlier, and had left his name carved on a wall of the Temple of the Three Windows. A German businessman named Augusto Burns had visited in the 1860s and had reportedly attempted to plunder artifacts for sale. Bingham was not the first outsider to see Machu Picchu. He was the first to bring it to global attention through the specific media channels of 1911, the National Geographic Society, which published his account in 1913, and Yale University, whose institutional backing lent credibility to what might otherwise have been dismissed as a traveler's tale. Bingham also took thousands of artifacts and human remains from the site under an agreement with the Peruvian government that allowed him to borrow them for study at Yale's Peabody Museum, with the provision that Peru could request their return. Peruvian demands for return went largely ignored for nearly a century. Most of the artifacts have since been repatriated following legal and diplomatic pressure that lasted until the 2000s. The dispute over the Machu Picchu artifacts was one of the longer-running repatriation conflicts in the history of cultural heritage law. What Bingham found has been documented, analyzed, debated, and studied for more than a century. What the site is today remains partly contested. The specific astronomical alignments built into the structures, the Intihuatana stone, which catches the sun at specific angles during the solstices, the Temple of the Sun, whose windows frame the sunrise on the summer solstice, and the Pleiades star cluster at certain times of year. The overall orientation of the site to major celestial events confirm that astronomy, ceremony, and cosmological belief were built into the architecture as deliberately as the drainage systems. Machu Picchu was not merely a resort, it was a statement about the Inca rulers' relationship to the cosmos, to the sun god Inti, and to the sacred landscape of the Andes. But the foundation underneath that statement, what actually kept the building standing, what actually chose this ridge from among all other ridges, what actually made it possible to build anything here at all, was geology, engineering, and organizational capacity operating at the highest level any pre-industrial civilization has achieved in the historical record. The Inca had no written language. They had no iron. They had no wheel. They understood tectonic geology well enough to choose the exact intersection of fault lines that would pre-crack their building material, drain their site, and supply their water. They developed a masonry technique that modern structural engineers identify as superior to mortared construction in seismically active environments. They moved 15-ton blocks of stone to a mountaintop without wheeled transport and fitted them together to tolerances that cannot be achieved with ordinary tools. They dedicated more than half their total construction effort to infrastructure that would never be seen and has never been properly credited, because what's buried under Machu Picchu is less photogenic than what stands above it. 600 years later, during a rainfall that reaches 80 inches per year, in a valley that has experienced earthquakes that destroyed every Spanish colonial structure built in the region, the water still flows through this stairway of fountains. The stones are still fitted so tightly that a piece of paper cannot slide between them. And the city that was built on a mountain ridge by a civilization that the world had largely stopped thinking about for 4 centuries is, today, the most visited archaeological site in South America and one of the most recognized structures on Earth. Subscribe for more, and tell us in the comments, which detail about how Machu Picchu was built surprised you most?